Good morning. So let me introduce myself. So I'm Santiago Schnell. I'm the William K. Foundation Dean of the College of Science. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our second science exploration series of this year. We're thrilled to host these lectures this semester, like any other semester that we do during football season, to celebrate the campus, both the sports and the science. We're featuring some fantastic speakers through the semester. So whether you're here in campus for a football visit or you're just around and you would like to listen some science, I'll welcome you to come on Saturdays at 11. And we're excited to show you some of these lectures because we're giving you what is the best of the College of Science. So now when some of you think about a football weekend, you may picture the energy of the stadium. The band familiar fight songs. For others, so you may imagine the tailgates. And with that always come the drinks. But we couldn't have some of those popular beverages that we drink during tailgates without the talented chemists who make them possible. The microphone, okay, so they're calling to my attention. I don't have the microphone on. Now it should work. Let's see. So today I'm pleased to introduce Professor Kuno from the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry, and as well he has an appointment in the Department of Physics. Professor Kuno holds a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Washington University in St. Louis and a doctorate in physical chemistry from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So you can notice he's a very bright guy. He pursued his postdoctoral research in the University of Colorado, and then he was a research scientist in the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory. Since 2003, he has been at the University of Notre, and he continues research and teaches undergraduate courses in physical chemistry, fermentation, and distillation, graduate classes in spectroscopy, and a few names. So are we okay with the microphone? Okay, I'll talk loud. Well, let me tell you why I'm excited that Professor Kuno will be speaking on the science of beer making. He literally wrote the textbook on the subject. You can see the textbook there, Introductory Science of Alcoholic Beverage, Beer, Wine, and Spirits. So, and it has been published by CRC Press, which is a fantastic press for the natural sciences. Let me tell you, it's very difficult to write a textbook. So very few scholars have the will and the strength and actually the ability to write a textbook on a topic and as well the expertise. So he's one of the few members of the College of Science that we're very proud to say that he has a textbook. His work illuminates the chemistry behind alcohol beverages and how impurities give rise to the distinct aromas and flavors of the finished products. I can tell you that this is going to be a great lecture, as Professor Kuno is both a highly accomplished scientist and instructor. In 2020, Professor Kuno won the Joyce Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. This award recognizes professors who have made a profound influence on undergraduate learning experience, elevate students' intellectual engagement, and foster students' ability to express themselves effectively within the context of their discipline. We're not only lucky, but we're incredibly grateful to have Professor Kuno with us here today. Please help me to give him a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess you folks didn't hear, at least the classrooms have. Can you hear me back there? You can hear me, right? No? I got the mic on. Oh, I'm going to talk loud then. All right, so you guys didn't hear about the free beer that's coming after this, right? Okay. So I want to thank Dean Schnell for the fantastic introduction. And as you already know, well, I go by my middle name, Kenneth. This is my first name. I just do that to confuse people. I'm going to talk about how to make beer, okay, and the science behind beer and alcoholic beverages. So what I want to start out with is the question, for example, how do you start out with very simple ingredients? And in particular, I'm focusing on barley or barley kernels. These are the seeds of the barley plant. And if you look at the case of the Bud Light, right, which is at Walmart and it hasn't been sold, and you look at the ingredient list, right, it's very simple. What does it have? It has water, right? It has barley. In the United States, we do things like add rice, which are called adjuncts. If you're German or you live in Germany, you'd probably frown upon this. And then what you have at the end is hops. This is literally the flower of a climbing vine called Humulus lupulus, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that shortly. And then that's basically it. The only thing that you add on top of this is yeast, which is the microorganism that does the fermentation. And I'll tell you more about the yeast in a minute. All right, so how do you go from this to get a product like this, which perhaps some of you have been consuming in great quantities this morning, or you will continue to do that following this lecture? And I'm going to claim that these are complex products, okay? And so if you're a beer aficionado, you might say, hey, that's not a particularly complex product. I have my favorite craft beer that I like, and that's way more complex than these lagers. But I'll argue, and I'll hope to convince you today, that these are chemically complex products. And you're basically tasting a lot of chemistry when you imbibe one of these beverages. So the talk you're going to see today is a fascinating intersection between a bunch of different topics. That includes chemistry, so unfortunately I have to tell you a little bit about chemistry. And just be aware that I'm a physical chemist, so I do lasers and semiconductors in my daily life. I don't really do organic chemistry. So the organic chemistry structures that I'm going to show you, I'm also allergic to it, okay? So I'm on your side. But I have to show you something. Dean Schnell has me contractually obligated to show you chemical structures. It also has something to do with history. So, for example, if you're familiar with the German Reinheitsgebot, okay, this is the German purity law from 1516, which dictates what can be used to make beer. You can't use just anything. And in fact, that's the inspiration for the ingredient list in the Bud Light box, okay? Because the Germans, they said back in 1516, you can only use barley, water, and hops, and that's it. And later on, they figured out, well, you need yeast too. Okay, but that's it. That's the only way to make beer. It also has something to do with, like, for example, IPAs, India Pale Ales. Have you ever wondered why India is involved in beer? What does India have to do with it? It also has something to do with art. For example, in the 18th century in England, they had a gin craze where the English were drinking large quantities of gin. And so artists like William Hogarth here made murals or drawings to suggest that it's more virtuous to drink beer than spirits. Okay, so live a virtuous life here. Not here on Gin Lane, excuse me. And then it also has to do with social movements. So, for example, here, folks in the back, please sit down. I mean, there's plenty of room here. It'll be a good talk, I hope. Social movements. Prohibition is the one that impacts us the most. And in fact, prohibition is one of the major reasons that you see these lagers at the bottom. The lagers that you're drinking are these light, straw-colored beverages that the Germans make fun of, okay? It has something to do with prohibition. So I need to start out with chemistry, okay? And unfortunately, I need to tell you a little bit about sugars. Now, perhaps some of you have thought, maybe there's just one kind of sugar, the table sugar that you're familiar with. But I think all of you at some level know that there's many, many kinds of different sugars. So I need to start out with the simplest sugars that are involved in alcoholic fermentation, from which I'm going to work my way up, tell you a little bit about yeast in Act 2. In Act 3, I'll tell you about fermentation, and finally I'll end with the beer, okay? So there are many kinds of simple sugars. I'm going to talk about what are called monosaccharides, and as the name suggests, it's mono, one simple sugar, and they have a definite chemical composition composed of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens in a very specific ratio of 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. And so here's the chemical formula. Now, in your daily lives, you've probably heard of glucose. If you haven't, or you perhaps haven't had an intimate relationship with glucose, know that it's a very important blood sugar, especially, for example, those who have diabetes or familiar with people who have diabetes. It's an important blood sugar that you have to monitor. So here's glucose. We can also talk about what's called galactose. If you like milk products, it's in milk. It's a simple sugar in milk, again with the same composition, C6H12O6. And then finally, fructose, if you like fruits and you're eating your vegetables too, inside fruits is a natural sugar called fructose with the same chemical composition, C6H12O6. Now imagine the carbons, the hydrogens, and the oxygens are basically different colored Lego blocks. If you give your kid green, red, and orange Lego blocks, 6, 12, 6, you know that your kid can arrange those Lego blocks in different ways. Same thing with the chemistry, the carbons, the hydrogens, and oxygens, you can arrange them in different ways. So, what I'm showing you here is the chemical structure of glucose. These are carbons, which I'm showing you over here. Sorry, there's no carbons here. I'll tell you about that in a minute. Carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens arranged relative to each other. And these structures are called Kekule structures after a German scientist named August Kekule, who probably had one too many to drink one night and had this dream of having a snake eat its own tail, and from which he came up with chemical structures from which we today have this shorthand notation for different chemicals. So we're going to depict structures like this. C for carbon, H for hydrogen, O for oxygen. Those are the atoms. Sticks will depict the chemical bonds that link the different atoms relative to each other and in the different orientations. And where the sticks intersect, you're going to have a carbon atom here, which I'm leaving off just for notational simplicity. Now, there's also this three-dimensional notation that I'm trying to show you here. You see these sticks that are basically dark triangles? Those are bonds that are trying to come out towards you. And then the dashed lines are bonds that are pointing away from you. So this is a very primitive way of trying to show you three-dimensional structure. So your kid has got those Lego blocks, or the different carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. Arrange it this way, and you get glucose. Now, for those of you out there who are really, really fast, you look at galactose, what's the difference? You're going to tell me the difference is on carbon atom number 4. That OH points down in glucose, and in the case of galactose, someone yanked it up. It pulls, it goes up. And that's the only difference between glucose and galactose. And I know all of you are saying, big whoop, so what? But it makes a huge difference in their chemical properties, as I'm going to try to illustrate shortly. Okay, so just wait for it. Then if you look at fructose, you can see that someone took this group and just moved it over here to carbon atom number 1, and so that just makes fructose. Again, same composition. Fair enough? Next, I'm going to show you that these structures are not static. Okay, so when we see chemical illustrations of molecules, you might think that they're static structures, but molecules are dynamic. Wow. I'm really loud today. All right, so the molecules are flexible and they basically move around. And in fact, molecules can actually rearrange themselves in different ways. So if you remember the fructose that I showed you on the previous slide, well, that's not the only way you can make fructose, okay? Fructose can actually change shape. You can sometimes find it in a linear form like this, sometimes in a 6-membered ring form like this, or this, which you saw, or a 5-membered ring. And underneath, I'm just showing you the percentage of time you're going to run across it, 75, 21, 4. So some structures are more stable than others. Okay, so that's why I'm going to draw fructose this way. But the take-home message at this point is that molecules are flexible. So now I'm going to talk about the next level of complexity in sugars. I've shown you 3 simple sugars. I'm going to show you 3 more to give you a total, I can't count today, 6 simple sugars, okay? So in this case, these will be called disaccharides, and as the name suggests, di means 2, and in my simple chemical math, that's just 2 simple sugars coming together and being linked together with a glycosidic bond. That's just the name for the bond that links 2 simple sugars. Among them, you're familiar with sucrose. That's table sugar that you know and love. Yes? Table sugar. Sucrose, I liken it to basically a glucose plus a fructose in my very simple chemical math. Lactose, if you're lactose intolerant, I guarantee you'll know it. And if you're lactose intolerant, your body doesn't like this sugar or disaccharide. And I liken lactose to literally a galactose plus a glucose linked together. And of course, there's different ways to put them together, but that's the basic idea. And then finally, maltose or malt sugar, I liken it to simply a glucose plus another glucose. Very simple, yes? Even I can do that math. All right. Next. At this point, do you remember the first slide? There's going to be a pop quiz, don't worry. Remember the first slide where I showed you that the barley kernels are what you're using to make the beer? And you're saying, hey, you know what? It's not like General Mills or Kellogg sells boxes of barley kernels and I scoop them up and eat them like Cocoa Puffs, right? Nah. And in fact, if you've brewed your own beer, and if you ever tasted a barley kernel, it's not like particularly sweet. So you're like, and this is sort of dating myself, where's the beef? Or in this case, where's the sugar, right? So the barley kernels aren't sweet. So then you're saying, where's the sugar? The sugar's there. It's just that it's tied up in these very long chains of glucose molecules that are called starches. Okay, so you can have linear forms, you can have branched forms, and these starches are where the yeast will use, which will break it down to get the sugars. Now, in order to get the simple sugars that the yeast can consume without choking, so to speak, you need molecular scissors, right? So you need some scissors to come and start chopping these bonds to give you the glucose molecules. Those molecular scissors are called enzymes. And so during the beer making process, and specifically during the mashing process, you have enzymes that start to break these bonds to give you the simple sugars that the yeast will use. Fair enough? Now, starches are part of a larger class of compounds called carbohydrates or carbs in general life. And so these are compounds that have definite ratios of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen, and you've already seen some examples of that. So when you look at the nutritional label of your beer, the Mick, or the Natty Light that you're drinking, when you look at it, it says this many carbs, right? This many grams, and that adds to the calorie count because those are the starches that are present that are going to add to the calories in your body, okay? All right, so those are starches that were not broken down and consumed by the yeast to make to make beer, to make alcohol. Now, if you look at this table, starches are used from different starting materials to make different alcoholic beverages. So, for example, we use barley traditionally to get the starch to make beer. We use barley traditionally to get the starch to make whiskey. Corn is used to make bourbon or moonshine, rye, whiskey, rice, sake, potatoes, vodka, and then if you go down here, grapes and other food products, those actually have simple sugars to begin with, glucose and fructose, and so there's actually no enzyme molecular scissors step that you need in order to get simple sugars. In fact, I think, if you want to disagree with me, we can talk about it, it's actually easier to make a wine than it is a beer. You literally take grapes, you squash them, you get the grape juice, and then you just sprinkle in yeast. In fact, the grapes already have their yeast as wild yeast on the skins, okay? So it's very easy to make a wine. I'm not guaranteeing it's going to be very good, but it's easier, right? This requires the enzymes to do something to break down the starches. All right, next. You might have wondered, hey, you know what? On all these foods, you're telling me there's sugars. So I have a link to a USDA website where you can, on your own, do your own research and go in and figure out the sugar breakdown of your favorite food products. So for example, apples have a large fraction of their sugars as sucrose. Blueberries, I'm going to use all of the boards today. Blueberries, most of their sugars are glucose. Cherries, mostly glucose, but pears and grapes, mostly fructose. And this matters, and I'm going to show you why it matters on the next slide. And hopefully everything I'm talking about is pedagogical and refers back to a previous slide. All right, so let's do this. If you remember when I said, hey, you know what, the only difference between glucose and galactose was that O and the H and carbon atom number 4, one pointed down, the other one pointed up, and I know you said big whoop, and then I said, hey, that matters from a chemical standpoint. It matters here. If you rank order the sweetness of all of these sugars that I've shown you, 6 sugars, 3 mono and 3 disaccharides, they're not all equally sweet. So I'm going to use sucrose as a reference point. Sucrose is a relative sweetness of 1. Anything below 1 is less sweet. Anything above 1 is more sweet. And if you look at galactose and glucose, not that you have a bag of it, but glucose is twice as sweet as galactose for a very simple change in the position of the atoms. Fructose is even more sweet, over 2 times as sweet as glucose. You can see that this number is close to 2. In fact, it's sweeter than sucrose. And so when you go back to the previous slide, when you bite into an apple, it's sweet. But blueberries, not so sweet. Sucrose, glucose. Pears, grapes, they're much sweeter too. Why? Fructose, right? So sweetness is a consequence of the differences in the molecular structure, albeit very small differences, okay? Oops, sorry. Now I want to talk about artificial sweeteners. I put this here for fun. It turns out that there are artificial sweeteners like aspartame, which goes by the brand name NutraSweet or Equal. You can also get saccharin, which goes by the name Sweet and Low. These are compounds that chemists have found accidentally. This is an entire lecture for a different day. It shows you that you need to be careful in the lab, but these guys, they were kind of sloppy and they ended up tasting whatever they were making in lab by accident, okay? But these things are way more sweet, up to 500 times sweeter than anything that's natural, okay? So that's a different story. So now I know some of you make your own beer, or I know some of you are beer aficionados, and I know that you know that there's been a controversy, or at least a debate, about whether you should use corn syrup to make beer. Because a number of years ago, Budweiser had a commercial where they said, hey, our product is made using no corn syrup. Whereas Miller, Mick, Ultra, Busch, Natty, PBR, Colt, Corona, all of these guys, they somehow cut corners and they use, corn syrup. Now, from a chemical standpoint, is that bad to use corn syrup? What is corn syrup? I don't know. So for me, corn syrup is this product that I find at Meijer or your local superstore in the baking food section, Caro. Okay? Corn syrup is literally a glucose solution, right? They get the starch, they use the enzymes to do the molecular scissors, you make a solution, it's a kind of a viscous solution, and you sell it because it's sweet. You can use it to do stuff with it. And beer manufacturers said, hey, I have a very cheap source of glucose which starches will eat to make ethanol and carbon dioxide. Why not use that, right? Why do all the extra stuff when I can just buy a bottle of this plus my other stuff and make beer? So from a chemical standpoint, glucose, that's the same glucose, or just a dollar is a dollar, okay? So sugar is a sugar. Doesn't really matter where it came from. From a chemical standpoint, using corn syrup isn't such a bad thing. Maybe from a traditionalist standpoint, it goes against, what you think a beer should be or how it should be made, okay? So there's the difference. Now, you might have heard of corn syrup's evil cousin, right, called high fructose corn syrup. You've heard of it, right? Because a lot of folks claim that it's the source of America's obesity epidemic, right? And there's some reason to believe that, because if you look at the food products, for example, you can obviously see that it's going to be in Coke, it's going to be in Pepsi, and all these other products. And in fact, companies that do soda or pop or however we want to call it, I don't know what part of the country you're in, but soda, pop, whatever, these companies, they wanted a cheap source of sugar, so it's natural that you have high fructose corn syrup really high up on the ingredient list. But you'll find it in many things. Just keep looking, it's frightening. You'll find it in Ritz, you'll find it in other crackers. I mean, those are salty products, right? Nah, they got sugar in them. You can find it in ketchup. Why would ketchup have sugar in it? It's got sugar. Keep looking. It's even in bread. If you ever gone to Target, look at the ingredient list of their bread, it's got high fructose corn syrup. That's frightening. So there's a lot of companies putting a lot of sugars in places you wouldn't expect, and you're consuming a lot of that. All right, so high fructose corn syrup is everywhere. Now, how did high fructose corn syrup come to be? So here's a little history lesson. In the 70s, okay, there were a lot of tariffs on sugar in this country. Okay, so that made the price of sucrose very expensive. So manufacturers of Coke, Pepsi, and other sodas, they said, we need another cheap source of sugar. And so what happens? We have a lot of corn and a lot of corn syrup. Just look no further. Just drive 2 miles outside of South Bend or your favorite Midwest town. Miles and miles of cornfields. The U.S. government subsidizes farmers to produce corn. And with all this extra corn, you got to do something with it. And in 1957, some scientists at Corn Products Refining Company in Argo, by the way, Corn Products Refining Company is the original manufacturer of Caro, okay? These scientists found an enzyme, okay, which can basically convert glucose into fructose. Do you remember I told you molecules are flexible? You can just start to move things around. In this case, the enzyme does it. It moves the groups of atoms around. It doesn't add, it doesn't subtract. It just moves it around. And you go from glucose to fructose. And you, the scientist, the engineer, can control that. So you have train loads of now high fructose corn syrup 55, which is a 55% solution, high fructose corn syrup 42, a 42% solution. And this Pepsi, Coke, and any food manufacturer that wants sweetness, you're going to buy it because it's cheap, okay? And do you remember the sweetness rank order? It's twice as sweet. You get more sweetness bang for your buck by using high fructose corn syrup. It's cheap and it's sweet. That's why they use it. All right, so next slide. I need to talk about the next actor involved in alcoholic fermentation, which is the yeast. Now, the yeast is essentially a microorganism, kind of like a bacteria, but a single-celled microorganism that's going to consume the sugar, and at the end, it's going to produce ethanol and carbon dioxide. But the yeast, or perhaps a bacteria that I'm going to show you here, They're not interested in producing ethanol. They don't care about that. That's their waste product. The reason they're going to do what's called fermentation, which is to eat the sugar essentially, is to produce a chemical called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. This ATP chemical is essentially what's called the chemical currency or energy currency of life. It is what gives cells energy to live. That's what they want. And it just so happens that they poop out on the back end, in the case of the yeast, ethanol and carbon dioxide, which is what we use to make an alcoholic beverage. So here I'm showing a picture of Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Are you guys intimate or familiar with Saccharomyces cerevisiae? Oh, of course. The answer is... Yeah, the answer, but you see, 80%, you ever see that movie Limitless with Bradley Cooper? You know, like 80% of your mind has all this fantastic knowledge. It's locked in there. You're just not always using it. But you have this knowledge. I'm going to show you. You're going to be like, yeah, we have this. You are intimate with Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and I'm going to prove it to you, okay? So this is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It's used to make pretty much all beers, with the exception of lagers, okay, or pilsners. It's basically used to make brandy. It's used to make wine. It's used to make spirits, tequila, mezcal, whiskey, bourbon, moonshine, pretty much anything. This is lactobacillus. This is a bacteria. You can see the difference in the shape. One is spherical or globular. The other one's going to be rod-like. Here's their pictures. Smile. Okay? So now what happens is that when Saccharomyces cerevisiae sees glucose, it says, I can eat that. I'm going to make ATP, but I'm going to spit out some chemical called pyruvate. I don't really care about it. Okay? But this pyruvate does what's called alcoholic fermentation to produce ethanol. So the yeast goes up in my flowchart. The bacteria, which also does fermentation to live, produces ATP. It produces pyruvate, but it goes down in my flowchart. And it produces, in this case, lactic acid. So if you are a home brewer and you forgot to star sand your carboy and your instruments, and you accidentally got a sour beer, it's because you have lactic acid in your beer. It's contaminating it. And I'll come back to this in a minute. Are we okay? This is like my math class. It's very quiet. I always tell my students, what?
You want us to make more noise?
No, I mean, I should feel the joy of her learning. Okay, so look, the historical realization of yeast goes back to this guy, Louis Pasteur. He's a very famous French chemist, okay? And Louis is known for many, many different things. Vaccine development, he made vaccines for anthrax and chicken cholera and rabies and all that stuff. But we know him for having discovered or realized that yeast were responsible for fermentation. Very prolific dude. Started out studying the optical activity of organic crystals. Basically, he was a crystallographer. I don't find that very interesting, but anyway, back then it was cool. He became a professor at 26. I don't know what I wasn't doing this at 26, all right? But very early on, very successful, dean at 32, winning some medals. Serious guy, this historian Barnett says, what does he say? Serious, obsessed, humorless, that's a sin, humorless, conservative, and so forth. And he's got letters from Marie to their daughter complaining that the guy just goes to lab and works all day, okay? So here's a photo of him in his lab. But where we have Pasteur get into the picture is in 1854, Pasteur was teaching a class like this, okay? And he had a student, and his student's dad was making alcohol. Now you should understand, back then people did not know how alcohol was produced. They just knew that if you followed this recipe, you would get alcohol, okay? But sometimes it wouldn't work. You'd get something bad. It wouldn't look right. And so the son is like, hey, Professor Pasteur, can you help my dad out? So Pasteur is like, sure, I'll help you out. And metaphorically, he pulls out the microscope from his closet, okay, and starts to look at the solutions that the dad is using to make alcohol. And in the solutions that worked, that made good alcohol, he saw these spherical, globular-like things. In the solutions where it didn't work, he saw these rod-like things. Sound familiar? Good alcohol, bad alcohol, okay? So then long story short, Pasteur figured out, hey, you know what? If the bacteria, right, is responsible for bad alcohol, I just need to get rid of the bad bacteria, right? How should I do that? And so he figured out we can heat the solution or heat foodstuffs to kill the bacteria. And so today when you make food products and you do this flash heating to kill bacteria, this process is called pasteurization in Louis Pasteur's honor. Okay, so milk products, you'll see it's pasteurized. That's after this guy. Now, history isn't this linear story that we tell students and tell ourselves. In fact, it's more complicated, which makes it more interesting. It turns out that 200 years before Pasteur even pulled out his microscope or thought about yeast, there was this Dutchman named Antony van Leeuwenhoek, okay? And Antony is one of these interesting characters, one of these folks who have this sort of expansive mind and wants to tinker with stuff. He was a draper by trade, okay? So it's clothing, cloth, threads. And it's said that he got interested in the quality of his threads, so he wanted to look at them more carefully. So he started in his garage to make microscopes. And here's a picture of one of his original microscopes, where you see that little ball there? That's a spherical ball lens. Okay, so he found a way to make high-quality spherical ball lens. You have done the same experiment that Van Leeuwenhoek did many years ago. If you've ever looked at a drop of water on a table, right, and you look through the drop of water, you see that what's beneath it is magnified, right? So all Antony van Leeuwenhoek did was find a secret way. He didn't tell people, he had a trade secret, how to make these perfect spherical ball lenses so that he could look at little things. And here's a picture of him putting his eye up to this and looking at things. He looked at many, many different things, some more controversial than others. I won't go into that. You can Google that. But he looked at pond water. He looked at beer. Why would you look at beer? He looked at beer, and what did he see in the beer? He saw little round globule-like things. This is an actual drawing that he was basically making like here. Oops. And sending to the Royal Society in England. The Royal Society is kind of like your National Honor Society if you've got kids, okay, or you went through this process yourself at some point. So he was sending these pictures or drawings to the National Honor Society for Scientists back then. He got elected or inducted into it, but he was the one who first saw yeast because he thought they were alive, and he called them little animals or animalcules. So he's the one who actually figured this out first, not Pasteur. Okay. Now, the person who actually realized or made practical the use of yeast to make the beer that you're going to consume today at some point, right, or presumably, okay, or have consumed, is this guy, Emil Hansen. These are his photos. He's got an interesting history. It's a little bit of a hard life. He painted houses to make money for the family and drew people's portraits and stuff like that. I won't go into that. But he decided he wanted to follow a scientific career, get a PhD. So in 1877, he finished his PhD in Copenhagen at the university there. And then he was soon after hired by Carlsberg Brewery. Do people like Carlsberg's beer? No? Okay. I'm going to ask you guys something about Carlsberg in a minute. So in Copenhagen, there's a brewery called Carlsberg. It's named after the guy's son. Okay? So JC made the brewery after his son's Carl. So that's why it's called Carlsberg. They make a product. And they were having problems. Sometimes the beer would be okay or a batch would be okay. Sometimes the batch would be bad. And they had a laboratory and they wanted to improve their quality control. So they hired Emil Hansen to go figure out why they were having bad beer, bad production runs. So Emil got to work, and Emil knew about Pasteur's work. And what do you know about Pasteur's work? If you see little round things, good. If you see rod things, bad. So he figured out, rather than kill stuff, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to go figure out how to isolate the good yeast that's making the good beer. So I don't know how, but he isolated the yeast, cultured it, grew it up, and then started to make beer with this cultured single strain yeast. That yeast was called Carlsberg's Bottom No. 1. It later became called Saccharomyces carlsbergensis after the brewery, and later Saccharomyces pasteurianus after Louis Pasteur. So that's why we have Carlsberg's beer today in its current form. Now you should know that, Emil got kind of tired. I have to be careful. It's like one of these smartphones, you just accidentally touch things. Emil got tired of growing the yeast by hand. Okay, so he made a machine. And this machine he sold to like Heineken, and he sold it to the Schlitz Brewing Company in Milwaukee. And so he made this machine because he got tired of making it. Okay. Anyway, here's the pop quiz. Oh, here's the quiz part. What kind of beer is Carlsberg's beer? And I'd give everyone a hint here. We'll divide the beer world into lagers and ales. What kind of beer is Carlsberg? Yeah, I like that. Lagers, right? It's kind of a lager. What kind of yeast was used to make the lager? Saccharomyces pasteurianus. And I know you remember, because you're paying attention, that a few slides ago, I told you that this guy, whose photo I have here, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, was used to make pretty much all alcoholic beverages. So if you wanted to consolidate your knowledge at this point, if you want to divide the beer world into ales and lagers, ales are made using Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Lagers are made using Saccharomyces pastorianus. Okay, so hopefully that's a good take-home message at this point. Next. I know during the pandemic you were baking, right? We all were baking. And after your 100th loaf of bread, you were thinking, what else could I do with this yeast that I have in the fridge? Okay? And it turns out you can do something else like make alcohol. So baker's yeast is basically Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And it produces ethanol and carbon dioxide when you give it sugar. And so there's a university in Saudi Arabia called KAUST, King Abdullah University of Science and Technology. Have you heard of it? Oh, okay. It's a university there. They have a lot of cash, right? They give you like $1 million salary if you wanted to go out there and work there as a foreign scientist. So there's a lot of foreign scientists who go to Saudi Arabia, okay, to work there at the university, but they become prolific bakers, and they bring a lot of yeast with them. Okay. Anyway, so one of the popular yeasts that I'm familiar with is Fleischmann's. You've heard of Fleischmann's? I mean, you see it at Meijer, Target, you see it at all these stores. Fleischmann's. So Fleischmann's got an interesting story, which I want to tell you right now. Fleischmann's was started by a guy named Charles Fleischmann and his brother Max, or Maximilius Fleischmann. They came from Austria, or Vienna in particular, and they came to the New York area, and then they eventually moved to Cincinnati. I'm not sure why. Ended up in the Cincinnati area. And they were really disappointed with the quality of bread here in the States, because at the time we didn't use yeast to make bread. I don't know what we did, but we weren't using yeast. They liked the bread back home better. So they started importing yeast from back home in order to make bread here. And they started a company called Fleischmann's. All right, so now to advertise the Fleischmann's company at this Centennial Exhibition, which is basically, what I understand, the world's first World's Fair, they started baking products in front of folks. So you can imagine if they have a stand, they're baking bread in front of you, smells good. By the way, I'm going to tell you why it smells good shortly. Smells good. Excuse me. Again, I have to be careful with that. Smells good, and then probably tastes good. So they became extremely wealthy. I liken Fleischmann's to like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg of their day. Did you know that the Fleischmann's family had an island in Hawaii, which is the inspiration for Gilligan's Island, for those who are my age and older? They own that island. Okay? They also started Starkist tuna. You familiar with that? Okay, so very, very wealthy. And in fact, Fleischmann's also makes gin. I've never seen that product, but I believe you can buy it online. But I'm going to tell you that Fleischmann's impacts your life or your public life even today. Are you familiar with Elizabeth Holmes? Sure, if you're into tech, you know that Elizabeth Holmes, who modeled herself after Steve Jobs with the black turtleneck, is a Stanford dropout, and she started a company called Theranos. And the idea for Theranos is that, when you go to the doctor for your annual physical and you get the blood drawn, it's like, you get 2 vials, 3 vials of blood drawn. Elizabeth's like, I'm going to make a machine where 1 drop of blood at your local Walgreens, 1 drop of blood is going to run 200 tests. You're going to get your results in 1 hour, just like the photos, right? When you take your camera there. One drop of blood. So the machine was called Edison, okay? And it turns out, long story short, that this was fake. It was all scientific fraud. And she was convicted recently in federal court for wire fraud, and presumably she's been sentenced to some time in some nice place somewhere else. But Elizabeth here, he's actually related to the Fleischmann's family. Okay, she's the 3rd great-great-great-granddaughter of Charles Fleischmann, and you're wondering why. So Charles Fleischmann, he had a family physician, family doctor. I mean, it's nice if you have your own personal doctor, whose name was Christian Holmes. Now, Fleischmann had a daughter named Betty. Betty ended up marrying the family physician, and that started the Holmes side of the family, of which we know Elizabeth Holmes. So now you know a little bit of trivia for the next time you go to the linebacker or your favorite establishment tonight, and you're telling people you learned something today in addition to whatever football we're talking about. Act 3, I got to tell you about alcoholic fermentation. I've told you about the sugars. Now you're experts on the sugars. I've told you about the yeast, at least in my mind. They're just these globular things. The sugar goes into the yeast. Once it goes into the yeast, there's some scary chemistry that happens. But the scary chemistry is to produce ATP, right? Not ethanol or carbon dioxide. So what we see is this. What it wants is this. So on this next slide, I'm showing you a very simple version of this reaction. My biochemistry colleagues would probably throw something at me at this point because this is way too simple. But what happens is that you take the sugar, I'm going to use glucose, take the sugar, there's some stuff, don't worry about the stuff, I don't know what it is either. There's some stuff, it becomes this chemical called pyruvate. I'm going to highlight that green because we're at Notre Dame. Pyruvate, it produces ATP, the yeast is very happy, it gets to live another day. All right, next, you see that pyruvate? It sticks around. If something sticks around, it can react and do something else. What happens? That pyruvate then comes down here. It finds a hydrogen somewhere. If it finds a hydrogen, it becomes what's called acetaldehyde, and it also produces carbon dioxide. That's the CO2 in the fermentation process. But you see this acetaldehyde? Anyone do distilling here? Okay, well, okay, so I know, again, that 80% of the brain that's being tapped right now, you know that if you have too much acetaldehyde, it's got a green apple note, right? That'll make your beverage very undrinkable. So anyway, you don't want too much of this, but it sticks around, but it also reacts to make C2H5OH, which is ethanol, which is this product what we want. Okay, so we see the back end, this, to produce this. The yeast cares about that. Okay, fair enough? And this reaction is way more complicated, so I'm going to prevent my, I'm going to disappoint my biochemistry colleagues out here. Okay, so at this point, I want you to use your mind now. So I told you how ethanol is made by the yeast, okay? Glucose goes in, ethanol and carbon dioxide comes out. But if ethanol was the only thing the yeast produced, it wouldn't be a particularly interesting beverage. And I know you're saying, hey, you know, what we do is we add hops and we add a whole bunch of different things. But in your mind, just imagine you didn't have the hops. It wasn't the extra hoppy IPA you just drank. Just get rid of the hops. Get rid of the extra malty stuff that you add because of the different malts that you use or the different roasting for the malts. I'll talk about that. And in your mind, just compare the difference between an ale and a lager. So if you were able to do that, I know you can, you know that these lagers, the ones that you're drinking, are these light, crisp, neutralish, transparent beverages. But an ale, like a Belgian ale, has a larger flavor backbone or body to it. And that's because the yeast produces other chemicals, which I'm going to talk about. If it just produced ethanol, it would be like diluted vodka, okay? And vodka, by the way, is credited, the invention of it, to this Russian scientist named Dmitry Mendeleev, who, usually we have a periodic table here, who is credited with coming up with the periodic table, And in fact, his PhD thesis is called A Discourse on the Combination of Alcohol and Water. That's a great PhD thesis. You become an experimentalist that way real fast, okay? So it turns out this is urban legend. Someone actually read the thesis, which is rare, but someone read it, and basically they figured out he is not the inventor of vodka because there's no special mention of a 40% ABV solution. But anyway, we'll pretend that's still true. Dilute vodka, pretty neutral. So the difference between an ale and a lager has to do with the other things that the yeast produces. So because I'm a very simple person, I have to break down that chemistry into this flow chart, okay? So here's the sugar. It goes in the yeast. It becomes pyruvate. There's ATP produced here that the yeast consumes to live. Then we make acetaldehyde, and then it goes and becomes ethanol in the alcoholic fermentation part. Stop, right? No, you see that pyruvate? You see the arrows that connect it? They go down, they go left, right. It's too early in the morning. It goes right, and you can see all these things in boxes. Hey, it makes organic acids, fatty acids, some sulfur stuff that smells real bad. It makes what are called ketones. It makes fusel alcohols. Really? You know that yeast produces more than just ethanol? It produces other alcohols or so-called fusel alcohols. If you're German, you would know that this means bad alcohol, okay? So it produces heavier alcohols. If you're a distiller, you know this too. It's the oily residue at the very end on the tails part of your run. I'm going to talk about this, and it also produces esters. I'm going to end with this. So let's go here. Heavier alcohols. That just means that you see this OH. In chemistry, the OH just means it's an alcohol. The stuff on the left-hand side is what distinguishes the alcohol. They have different names. You don't have to remember it, okay? This is not on your exam. Different names. But if you look in the parentheses underneath it, it's going to give you different flavors and aromas. Some of them have an apple note, fruity note, malty note, burnt note, orange, rose, honey note, and so forth, okay? So these alcohols are also present by the yeast, or produced by the yeast, okay? Next, some of you are familiar with methanol, right? You know methanol is something that you don't want to consume because too much of it will make you blind or kill you. But methanol is a lighter alcohol, so it's not here. It's not here. Just trust me, okay? It's not here. It's not here. You don't see methanol or CH3OH. It's not here. Where's the methanol, right? Because the common fear of people who drink alcoholic beverages is that you don't want to consume methanol, especially homemade alcohol, right? So where does the methanol come from? It turns out that methanol, this compound, which looks like this in the lab, which makes you blind and kills you, and by the way, I've run the back of the envelope calculation. If you're 200 pounds, 100 mils of it's going to kill you, okay? But hopefully you'll never get to that point, right? This compound doesn't come from the yeast. It comes from the ingredients that you use to make the alcoholic beverage. Would I surprise you if I told you that the wine that some of you are consuming has methanol in it? No? Why? Because the skins of grapes contain a compound called pectin, which is a polysaccharide. It looks like this, and it's got these OCH3 groups. Again, I'm going to speed up a little bit. You see these OCH3s? That's the O, the C, and the H3s. I'm just missing a hydrogen. And what happens is that Pac-Man, or an enzyme, comes in called pectinesterase, and it chops this bond, right? It cleaves this to give you CH3O. It finds an H somewhere, and it becomes methanol. So the skins of grapes contain this compound plus the enzyme, which is why wine contains methanol. And in fact, if I had to list the concentrations of methanol in wine by ppm, you can see these numbers here for different wines from different countries, red versus white. Guys, what's the first, I know you're paying attention, what's the difference between a red and white wine here? The color and the skin, yeah? No, but in terms of the methanol, you see any trend here? Yeah, if you're drinking red wine, you're going to get more methanol. And you're like, what? Does that mean that red grape skins have more pectin in it, which gives you more methanol, versus white grapes? And the answer is no. It's how, and this is why it has color too, it's how the red wine is made. Red wine is made using red grapes that are crushed with the skins that are present during the fermentation. That gives not only the colors, because the chemical is called anthocyanins, but it also gives rise to the pectin, which gives rise to the methanol. That's why red wine has more methanol. Okay, so now it's more trivia. Now, let me talk about the esters. Let's go back to my flow chart. I made this. These guys can go and meet up and do some more chemistry, and they produce esters. What are esters? Esters are compounds that have this sort of formula, C and a double bond oxygen with an oxygen, and stuff on the left, stuff on the right. They're literally a combination of acids and alcohols. Okay, long story short. And you can get different esters, pineapple, banana, pineapple rose, sweet, sour apple, and so forth. And it's these esters that gives rise to the difference in flavor backbone between a lager and an ale. Why? Because when you make or ferment an ale, you're using Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but you're going to do it at higher temperatures, right, closer to room temperature, whereas lagers are fermented at low temperature. Don't worry, that's in the next slide. And at higher temperatures, you're going to get more of this chemistry to make esters. That's why, for example, if you have a Belgian beer like Chimay, it's going to have a higher fruity note because of the higher concentrations of esters in it. That's the chemical difference between esters and lagers and ales, excuse me. I'm going to now quickly start to finish out with Act 4, the beer. All beers in the world are more or less lagers and ales. Lagers, Saccharomyces pastorianus, ales, cerevisiae, low temperature, high temperature, longer fermentation cycle, shorter fermentation cycle. Okay, so any questions at this point? No? We're okay? All right. Next, quick story or segue into Budweiser, one of our favorite lagers by a company called Anheuser-Busch. Anheuser-Busch was started by Eberhard Anheuser, a German immigrant who made soap. Okay, has nothing to do with beer. He saved a failing St. Louis brewery. Okay, sounds familiar to anyone who knows Fritz Maytag? Anyone? American Craft Brew Revolution? Anchor Brewing Company? Okay, we'll drink some more beer and we'll talk about that later. But look, Eberhard Anheuser saved this company, and then he had a distributor named Adolphus Busch who basically married into the family, became Anheuser-Busch. After the Civil War, Busch travels to Europe and he ends up in what's called Bohemia, or today the Czech Republic. And he ends, by the way, anyone been to Prague? Right? Okay, you owe it to yourself. It's very beautiful. He ends up in, I can't pronounce it, Český Budějovice, but what's more important is that the Germans called it Bud Weiss. That's the name of the town. Here's a picture of the town. Looks really great, right? I'd like to go there. And what did the locals sell? They made beer. What did the locals sell? Budweiser. So, Busch comes there, they're selling Budweiser, and he's drinking, and he really likes it. He's like, man, I'm going to take home some of this. So he takes home the recipe, the elements of the recipe, the spirit of it, but he also takes the name. And he trademarks the name here in the U.S. And what happens? The locals, they eventually made a company called Budweiser Budvar. They learned that this friendly American guy who came over actually stole their name. And they were really upset. They sued him in U.S. federal court, and this lawsuit between the Czech company and Anheuser-Busch still goes on to this day. It's over 123 years, which is why if you go to Europe, right, I hope you'll do that soon, you'll see Budweiser in the Czech Republic. It's not the American Budweiser. It is the Czech product. And if you look at the Budweiser here, the logos are actually kind of similar. This is the Czech product, which means that in the Europe, you can't sell Budweiser as this. You got to sell it as Bud. And here in the States, we use Budweiser, and they have to go by the name Czech Var. Okay? So now you know some trivia for tonight. Brewing beer, you already know that you make beer using barley kernels. There's different kinds of kernels you can use. You don't just have to use barley. You can use wheat, oats, rice. The Germans frown on this. They're okay with this a little bit. That's why you can make wheat beers. But anyway, we can use any of these things for the starches. And what we do is we do a process called malting. The whole point of the malting is to basically get the sugars into a more manageable form for the yeast. As part of that, what we do is we toast and roast the malt. So you're going to get different colored malts. Pilsner malt, this is the name. Specialty malts called chocolate, crystal, and so forth, okay? It's like coffee beans, light roast, dark roast. And you can imagine that stouts like Guinness that you drink or porters, they're made using the darker stuff, which is why they have a darker color. Next, the chemistry behind this goes to a French guy named Louis-Camille Maillard here. And he was doing reactions between sugar molecules and amino acids. And he found that this led to some tremendous chemistry, which he didn't fully understand. But you should understand that food chemists today are still studying this reaction because if you bake bread, remember the Fleischmanns? Chemicals are produced during browning, roasting, toasting reactions that you smell, and that's also imbued in your beverage, in this case, beer. Bread, seared steak, fried food, roasted, toasted, any of these things undergo what's called the Maillard reaction. Now, the guy who figured out the Maillard reaction is an American, okay? His name was John Hodge. All right, here's a little history about the guy, but it's actually hard to find information about him. All right, these are photos that I found somewhere. If you know where I found them, please tell me, because I'm still looking for the original source. But he was a USDA scientist, and he figured out the reaction. And I'm going to show that in the next slide. You see this? This is frightening. You start out with a sugar, and it reacts with an amino acid, and then whole craziness starts to happen. I'm not going to go into that because I don't fully understand it. But everything in red is a chemical that the Maillard reaction produces. Let's just focus on what are called Strecker aldehydes and cyclic, Maillard products. Here are the Strecker aldehydes. In chemistry, aldehyde just means this group with the C and an O and an H. You can see it's common to everything. And on the left-hand side, that's all the differences. They have different names, but they have different flavor and aroma profiles. Roasted, malty, toasted notes, honey, vegetable, and so forth. The cyclic Maillard products, which have these ring structures, sulfurs, nitrogens, oxygens, they have caramel notes, burnt notes, nutty notes, baked notes. You're smelling furfural when you're baking bread. You're smelling this chemical. Nutty notes, meaty notes, and so forth. These are the chemicals that give rise to the other flavors in the beer that you're drinking. Next, hops. We have a flower of a climbing vine called Humulus lupulus. Here's the climbing vine, here's the flowers, and we add this for bitterness, okay? And inside the flowers are so-called lupulin glands, where you have two classes of chemicals that we care about. The first, they're going to be called humulones. They look like this. Trust me, the only thing that's different between this guy and this guy and this guy is in blue. That's it, okay? They just have different names. Now, do you remember, and I know you do, way back and I told you something about molecules? I said something about the structure being dynamic. Molecules are not static things. They change shape. And what happens when you heat these humulones? They change shape and they do this sort of, gymnastics, and they become isohumulones. You see, this goes from 6-membered ring to 5-membered ring. And if you're familiar with beer IBUs, everyone? Okay, the answer is always yes in this class. Yeah, IBUs. Bud has an IBU of 7, 22, 38. That is the amount of this chemical in parts per million that's in these beers. Okay, don't worry, I can tell you in my book how you measure it, but that's not important. So if you like really hoppy beers, you're going to have IBUs like closer to 100, okay? All right, so that's this chemical. Next, the oils. That gives rise to the piney notes and the aromas. Here are the chemical structures, very beautiful. I don't fully understand them. Very beautiful, but they have woody, spicy, citrusy, earthy, and flowery notes. This is why when you drink a hopped beer, you smell it. You're smelling this, okay? And so, to end, when you have a finished beer, whether it's something fancy or something more blue-collar or college-appropriate, okay, it is not a very simple drink. It has a lot of chemicals in it, whether it's from the yeast or something I didn't talk about, phenolics, Maillard reaction, and from the hops. This, as admittedly neutral and sort of bland, like the Germans would laugh about it, or off-colored special water, okay? It has very, very complex chemistry, and that's why I call it a complex product. And so, unfortunately, I didn't have time to go into all of the wonderful chemistry, and you'd have to take my class, okay? But you can also buy my book. I have to stop here. And so with this, I'm going to try to answer any comments, concerns, or questions that you might have. And if we don't have any comments, concerns, or questions, then I hope you enjoyed the rest of your day. Welcome to Notre Dame if you haven't been here before. And of course, as you're drinking that beer, just think of this. This is something that you can tell your friends tonight or at the next party that you're at. Anyway, thank you very much. Anything? Oh, wait. Let me ask over here.
Does your book have recipes?
No, I'm sorry. I don't provide recipes. But it's got cool molecules in it. I'm sorry, please. Oh, you had a question? Or no? Oh. No, I don't have the book here. It's on Amazon. I don't think the school did that for me. Oh, it's on Amazon. Just look at my name. I don't know where my name is. Well, okay. Here we go. That's my name. I'm sorry.
Some beers that I think are called hoppy have like a grapefruit.
Yeah?
Is that one of those?
Yes, it'll be another one of those chemicals.
I thought it actually had grapefruit in it.
Oh, some manufacturers might actually do that because, again, this comes back to the Reinheitsgebot, that German purity law. Look, in Germany, if you're like a craft brewer, you're trying to innovate or start your own brew in your backyard or garage, you can do whatever you want here in the States. For example, companies like to use corn syrup, In Germany, they are very traditionalist. The Reinheitsgebot says, nah, you can't do this innovation stuff. You're going to make the beer the old way, or at least we want you to make it the old way, right? So it's very, very difficult to innovate for many reasons in Europe. So here we can do more or less whatever. So I'm sure someone adds grapefruit elements to their beer.
Then it's a malt beverage.
Okay, here you go. Oh, yes, here, and then I'll get to the back. Sorry.
So it seems like you can change the flavor of the beer just by changing the sugar that you use.
I would do mostly the yeast. Right? So you know what these manufacturers do? They have entire catalogs of these yeasts. And inside the catalog, you literally flip through it. You can look online. They're called yeast banks. You'll see White Labs, and N45. It makes California-style beer. And you'll look at all of the flavor profiles that this yeast traditionally produces or typically produces. And so you can pick and choose as a beer producer what kind of yeast. Because remember, the yeast does all this craziness in addition to the ethanol. It's that craziness that adds the flavor backbone. Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, in the back.
You said that the I in IPA stands for India?
Yeah, India.
Why?
Oh, okay. The legend, the folklore that you're going to get is that, when the English colonized India, the troops in India needed beer. And back then, porters were, the darker, heavier beers, okay? The porters were in the rage, but, the troops in India, when it's like a 90-degree humidity and they didn't want to drink porters. That's actually more like a winter beer, no? Or like a cooler weather beer. So they wanted something lighter, okay? And so they said that, the brewers, okay, who started sending their beverage, they wanted to provide something that the troops would like. And furthermore, it took 6 months to get there on a boat, okay? Any beer that they sent over there would typically spoil. So the guys making the beer back in England said, we're gonna double the alcohol, double the hops, we're gonna do everything massively higher. And it turns out there's a chemical reason for why that preserves the beverage. The humulines, that bitterness compound, the hops, that actually is an antimicrobial. It kills bacteria, just like the ethanol. So more ethanol, like hand sanitizer, more ethanol, more hops, it kills bacteria, so it survives the journey. And the lighter style of beer, because they use different malts, gives rise to a India Pale Ale. And I think the only reason it's called India is because there was a company called the English, what was the name of the company? East India Company. They were making the beer to send to their troops or their folks out in India. That's why it's called India Pale Ale. Any further questions, comments? Oh, yeah.
So, in some beers you said actually use like a Fleischmann's type of yeast?
Some breweries?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't think so. I think they have their own specialty in-house secret yeast that they probably have.
Because I've thought about using that, but I never have. I always just use the brewing yeast.
Yeah, of course. You would probably want that because those are actually specified for making beers. Again, it's the impurities that matter. Right? But hey, that's not to say you couldn't make beer using Fleischmann's. I've never tried it though. Anything else? Okay, well, we'll stop here. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the day. Thank you.